The retired man heard a desperate echo coming from beneath the street, weak, frightened, and painfully familiar. When he looked down into the storm drain, his heart stopped. His old German shepherd had fallen inside. What happened next, the choice the man made and the risk he took without hesitation, would leave neighbors in tears and remind everyone that loyalty doesn't weaken with age. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep telling emotional stories about old dogs, second chances, and the bonds that never fade. The morning was quiet on Willow Creek Road, the kind of quiet that settled gently into retirement. Frank Miller liked it that way. At 74, he had learned to appreciate silence, especially the kind broken only by birds, wind, and the steady padding of paws beside him. Max, his old German shepherd, walked a few steps behind now. Age had slowed the dog, stiffened his legs, softened his once powerful stride. But Max never complained. He followed Frank every morning, no matter how slow the walk had become. "Easy, boy," Frank said with a smile, adjusting his pace. "We've got all day." They turned the corner near the old drainage system, a stretch of road Frank usually avoided. Recent rains had loosened the ground, and the city never rushed to fix things in this part of town. Frank took 2 steps forward. Then he heard it, a sudden metallic clang. A sharp yelp, short, terrified. Then silence, followed by a faint, echoing whine. Frank spun around. "Max!" The leash lay slack on the ground. Frank's heart slammed against his chest as he rushed back toward the sound. He reached the storm drain just in time to hear again Max's voice, trapped and distorted, rising from the darkness below. "No, no, no, no." Frank dropped to his knees and peered through the metal grates. Down below, barely visible in the dim light, Max lay wedged awkwardly inside the drain. One hind leg twisted beneath him. His chest heaved rapidly. His eyes, once calm and wise, were wide with panic. "You fell," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh, Max, I've got you. I've got you." But the drain was deep, too deep. Frank tried calling out to him, tried to keep his voice calm. "Stay still, boy. Don't move." Max whimpered softly, trying and failing to adjust his position. Frank looked around wildly. No one else was on the street. No passing cars. No neighbors outside. He pulled at the grate with both hands. It didn't budge. His fingers shook as he reached for his phone. Then he stopped. Max wasn't just scared. He was tired. Frank saw in the way the dog's breathing stuttered, and the way his head sagged against the concrete wall. Max didn't have the strength to wait long. Frank made a decision. He set his phone down. Slowly, carefully, Frank lowered himself to the pavement and slid one arm to the bars, stretching as far as he could. The cold metal bit into his skin. His shoulders screamed in protest. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm not leaving you." Max's tail moved faintly. Frank shifted, wedging his arm deeper, ignoring the pain. His fingers brushed fur just barely. "Good boy," Frank murmured, tears spilling freely now. "That's my boy." But he couldn't reach far enough. The drain was winning. Frank closed his eyes for a brief moment, then did something no one his age was supposed to do anymore. He lay flat on the ground and slid his shoulders through the grate. Pain shot through his chest and ribs. His breath caught painfully as his weight shifted forward, his upper body hanging into the darkness. But his hands found Max. He wrapped his arms around the old dog's chest, pulling him close, bracing his feet against the edge of the drain. "I've got you," Frank said, voice trembling but sure. "I won't let go." Max pressed weakly against him, trusting him completely. Frank began to pull. Every muscle screamed. His arms burned. His vision blurred. But he didn't stop, because some love doesn't care about age. Some bonds don't calculate risk. They just hold on. Frank Miller's arm shook violently as he hung halfway into the storm drain, his chest pressed hard against the cold metal edge. Pain shot through his shoulders and down his spine, sharp enough to steal his breath. At 74, his body was no longer built for this kind of strain. But he didn't pull back, not even for a second. Below him, Max whimpered softly, his warm body trembling against Frank's chest. The old German shepherd's breathing was fast and uneven, each shallow inhale echoing eerily off the concrete walls of the drain. "I've got you," Frank whispered again, more desperately now. "You hear me, boy? I'm not letting go." Max's ears twitched faintly. His tail scraped weakly against the concrete, the smallest signal of trust, but enough to tear at Frank's heart. Frank tried to lift. Nothing. The drain was deeper than he realized, and Max's weight, combined with the awkward angle, made it nearly impossible. Frank gritted his teeth, muscles screaming as he adjusted his grip, sliding one arm under Max's chest and the other around his shoulders. "Easy, easy," he murmured. Max let out a soft yelp as Frank shifted him slightly. Frank froze instantly. I'm sorry, he whispered, voice cracking. "I won't hurt you." Frank forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly. Panic would make him weak. Panic would make his arms slip. He looked up briefly, straining to see the street above him. The quiet neighborhood suddenly felt terrifyingly empty. No cars, no voices, no footsteps. "Anybody!" he shouted hoarsely. His voice echoed uselessly down the street. Frank's arms trembled harder. His hands were beginning to numb, fingers tingling as circulation strained under the weight. He knew that feeling. He'd felt it once before, years ago, when Max was still young and strong. Back then, it had been Max who pulled him out. The memory struck Frank suddenly and vividly. He had slipped on black ice outside the house one winter morning, fallen hard, his hip taking the full impact. Pain had exploded through him, blinding and immediate. Frank remembered lying there, helpless, cold creeping into his bones. Max had barked then, not panic, but urgent. He had grabbed Frank's coat gently in his teeth and pulled, over and over, until Frank managed to drag himself to safety. "You saved me," Frank whispered now, the memory giving him a sudden surge of strength. "This is my turn." Frank shifted his legs, planted his boots more firmly against the edge of the drain. His knees protested, joints aching fiercely, but he forced his body into a better angle. Slowly, painfully, he leaned back, used his body weight instead of just his arms. Max slid upward an inch. Frank gasped. "That's it," he breathed. "That's it. Max, stay with me." The metal grate creaked under the strain. Frank ignored it. His heart pounded wildly, each beat echoing in his ears. Sweat stung his eyes despite the cool air. He pulled again. Another inch. Max whimpered, but his body moved with Frank now, no longer dead weight, instinctively helping, however little he could. Frank's vision blurred. Black spots danced at the edges. He paused, resting his forehead briefly against Max's muddy fur, gathering what little strength he had left. "Don't you let go," he whispered. "Promise me." Max pressed his head weakly against Frank's chest. Then Frank heard it. Footsteps. "Help!" Frank shouted, his voice breaking. "Please, I need help." The footsteps stopped. A woman's voice called out, startled, "Oh my God!" Moments later, another voice joined hers. Then another. Panic rippled through the air above him. "Call 911, someone shouted. Frank barely registered it. His entire world had narrowed to the weight in his arms and the burning in his muscles. "Sir, hold on," a man's voice yelled. "We've got you." Hands grabbed Frank's jacket from above, gripping his shoulders, anchoring him. Relief flooded through him. So suddenly he nearly cried out. "On 3, someone said. 1, 2. Frank pulled with everything he had left as the others lifted. Max's body slid free of the drain with a scraping sound, his hind leg catching briefly before releasing. Frank felt the sudden shift in weight and nearly collapsed forward. But the hands held him. Together, they lifted Max onto the pavement. Frank slumped onto his side, chest heaving, arms useless. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. Then he felt Max's nose press against his cheek. Warm, alive. Frank laughed weakly, tears spilling freely. "You're out," he whispered. "You're out." The neighbors gathered around, some kneeling beside them, others standing back in stunned silence. A woman wrapped a jacket around Frank's shoulders. Someone else stroked Max's head gently. An ambulance siren wailed faintly in the distance. Frank turned his head just enough to look at Max. The dog lay stretched beside him, breathing heavily but steadily. His eyes were tired, but calm. "You did good," Frank murmured. "You stayed with me." Max's tail thumped once against the pavement. As paramedics arrived and knelt beside them, Frank closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. He had made the decision without thinking, to put his body between his dog and the danger, and he would make it again, without hesitation, because love doesn't weaken with age. It proves itself. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Frank Miller lay propped up on a narrow bed, and Ford taped his arm, his shoulder wrapped tightly in a brace. Every muscle in his body throbbed with a deep, exhausting ache, the kind that settled into the bones and reminded him of every year he had lived. But Frank barely noticed, because Max was alive. The old German shepherd lay on a thick blanket at the foot of the bed, his body curled carefully, one hind leg bandaged, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The vet had cleared him to stay, said separating them now would do more harm than good. Frank watched him quietly, eyes burning. "You scared me," Frank whispered. Max opened one eye and thumped his tail once, weak but deliberate. The doctor had warned Frank gently. Torn muscles, a cracked rib, weeks of rest, no lifting, no sudden movements. Frank had nodded politely, but he already knew the truth. If Max needed him again, rules wouldn't matter. Later that afternoon, the vet arrived, kneeling beside Max with practiced care. "He's stable," she said, "but this fall wasn't nothing. He's been compensating for pain longer than we thought." Frank frowned. "Compensating." "She's right," the doctor added. "So were you." Frank looked away. They didn't need to say it out loud. Age had been creeping up on both of them, quietly, patiently. Slower walks, longer naps, stairs taken carefully. Frank had told himself it was normal, but the storm drain hadn't been normal. It had been a reckoning. That evening, Frank brought Max home. The neighbors helped carry them inside, set up blankets, brought soup Frank barely tasted. One woman hugged him without asking. Another wiped her eyes when she looked at Max. Word traveled fast on Willow Creek Road. By the next morning, flowers lined the porch. Cards appeared, notes written in shaky handwriting, some from people Frank barely knew. "You reminded us what loyalty looks like. Thank you for not letting go." Frank read every one. Max sensed the attention, lifting his head when voices drifted through the window, tail moving faintly. He wasn't frightened anymore, but he was tired. That night, Frank slept on the couch beside him, one hand resting on Max's side, feeling each breath. He dreamed of water and darkness, and waking hands pulling him back into the light. He woke with tears on his face. Days passed slowly. Frank followed the doctor's instructions as best he could. He rested. He iced his shoulder. He took the pain meds, even though he hated how they dulled his mind. Max healed too, but not the way Frank hoped. The limp lingered. His breathing sometimes hitched. He hesitated before standing, as if calculating whether the effort was worth it. Frank noticed everything. One afternoon, as golden light spilled across the living room, Max struggled to rise and failed. He let out a soft huff. Not a cry, not fear, just resignation. Frank was at his side instantly. "Hey," he whispered, easing Max back down. "It's okay. You don't have to be strong anymore." Max looked at him, eyes deep and calm. Frank swallowed hard. The vet's words echoed in his mind. Compensating longer than we thought. That evening, Frank made another decision. He sat on the floor beside Max and spoke aloud, not because Max needed words, but because Frank did. "I won't let you hurt," he said quietly. "Not to prove something. Not for pride. Not for me." Max pressed his nose gently into Frank's palm. "I carried you once," Frank continued, voice breaking. "You carried me more times than I can count. If it's time for us to slow down together, then that's what we'll do." Max's tail moved once. The next weeks changed everything. Frank sold his car and arranged deliveries. He moved his bedroom downstairs. He built a small ramp by the porch with help from a neighbor. He adjusted his life around Max without resentment or complaint, and something unexpected happened. Frank felt lighter. The pressure to pretend he wasn't aging fell away. He no longer pushed himself to prove anything. He learned to sit longer, to breathe, to listen, and Max, no longer forced to keep up, relaxed. Their walks became shorter but richer. They stopped more, watched birds, felt the sun. One afternoon, Frank sat beside Max in the yard, watching clouds drift slowly overhead. "You know," Frank said softly, "falling in that drain might have saved us." Max's ears twitched. Frank smiled faintly. We needed to see the truth. That night, Frank dreamed again, but this time there was no darkness. Only light, only warmth, and a steady presence beside him. When he woke, Max was watching him, alive, calm. "Here." Frank rested his forehead against the dog's. "We're still here," he whispered. And for the first time since the fall, Frank understood. Saving Max hadn't just been about pulling him from danger. It had been about choosing how to live afterward. Together, the town returned to its routines, but Frank Miller and Max did not. Life slowed, deliberately, unmistakably, as if the fall into the storm drain had cracked something open that could no longer be ignored. The mornings no longer began with long walks or quiet determination to keep pace with the past. They began with stillness. Frank woke before sunrise, easing himself off the couch with care, joint stiff, shoulder aching dully. Max watched from his bed near the window, head lifted, eyes following Frank's every movement. He didn't rush anymore. He waited. "Morning, old friend," Frank whispered. Max's tail thumped softly. Frank brewed coffee and sat at the table longer than he used to, listening to the house breathe. The tick of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a truck starting somewhere down the road. Outside, the world moved faster than they did now. Inside, time had softened. They went out to the yard late morning, the sun gentle and warm. Frank leaned heavily on his cane, something he had avoided using for years. Pride had kept it tucked away in a closet, fear of needing it forever. Now he welcomed its steadiness. Max followed slowly, each step careful, measured. He no longer walked ahead. He stayed beside Frank, shoulder nearly brushing his leg, matching his pace without effort. Frank noticed. "You're watching out for me now," he murmured. Max's ears twitched. They reached the old maple tree near the fence and stopped there, as they often did now. Frank lowered himself onto the bench, exhaling deeply. Max eased down at his feet, resting his chin on Frank's boot. For a long moment, neither moved. Frank thought about how close he had come to losing him, how easily that fall could have ended differently, how narrow the space between here and gone truly was. "I was scared," Frank admitted quietly, "more than I let on." Max lifted his head slightly, eyes soft. "I thought if I let go for even a second, I'd never forgive myself." The breeze stirred Max's fur, lifting the gray hairs around his muzzle. Frank reached down and scratched behind his ear gently, exactly where Max liked it. "I'm not scared anymore," Frank said. "Not of slowing down. Not of what comes next." Max sighed, long and content. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. Frank struggled up, surprised. Visitors had become rare. When he opened it, he found Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. "I hope this isn't strange," she said softly, "but I made something." Inside the box was a thick, padded dog harness, custom size, sturdy but gentle, with handles along the top. "For Max," she said. "My son used to make these for working dogs. I thought it might help." Frank's throat tightened. "Thank you," he managed. Max sniffed the box curiously, tail wagging faintly. That harness changed everything. With it, Frank could help Max stand without straining either of them. They moved together, careful, synchronized, trusting. The small victories mattered now. Getting up without pain, walking to the fence, sitting beneath the tree. Frank realized something unexpected. Needing help hadn't weakened their bond. It had strengthened it. One evening, as the sky burned orange and purple, Max struggled suddenly. his breathing shallow, chest rising too fast. Frank felt panic surge instantly. "Hey, hey!" he whispered, lowering himself beside him. "Easy." Max's body trembled. His eyes flicked to Frank's face, searching. Frank held him, hands steady despite the fear clawing inside him. "You're okay. I've got you. I'm right here." The moment passed slowly, painfully, but it passed. Max's breathing steadied. His body relaxed. Frank stayed there long after, arms wrapped around him, tears silently soaking into fur. That night, Frank made another call, the hardest one yet. He spoke to the vet at length, listening carefully, asking questions he had avoided before, about quality of life, about signs, about when love meant holding on and when it meant letting go. When he hung up, his hands shook. Max rested his head on Frank's knee. "I don't know when," Frank whispered, "but I promise you something." Max looked up. "I won't let you be afraid. I won't let you hurt alone." The days that followed were gentle. Neighbors waved. Children stopped by to pet Max softly. Frank told stories he'd never told before, about his wife, gone years now, about working long hours, about mistakes he'd made and lessons he'd learned too late. Max listened, as he always had. One afternoon, as Frank dozed in the chair, Max struggled his feet and walked, slowly, deliberately, across the room. He rested his head against Frank's hand. Frank woke instantly. "What is it?" he whispered. Max didn't whine, didn't cry. He simply leaned there, breathing warm against Frank's skin. Frank understood. That night, under a sky full of quiet stars, Frank sat beside Max on the porch, wrapped in blankets. "We've had a good life," Frank said softly. "Haven't we?" Max's tail moved once. Frank smiled through tears. And deep down, he knew the truth he had been avoiding. The decision that mattered most was still ahead. The night was unusually quiet. No wind in the trees. No distant traffic. Just the soft creak of the porch boards and the steady rhythm of breathing beside Frank Miller's chair. Max lay on his favorite blanket, head resting on his paws, eyes half open. The old German shepherd no longer slept deeply. He drifted in and out, as if listening to something only he could hear. Frank watched him carefully, every rise and fall of Max's chest etched into his memory. "You're tired," Frank whispered. Max's ears twitched, but he didn't move. The vet's words echoed in Frank's mind, gentle, honest, unavoidable. There would be more days like this, then nights that were harder, then pain Frank couldn't carry away with his own hands. Frank had faced many hard decisions in his life. Retirement, loss, loneliness. But this one felt heavier than all the others combined, because it wasn't about letting go. It was about knowing when. Frank lowered himself from the chair and sat on the porch floor beside Max, wincing as his shoulder protested. He didn't care. He placed one hand on Max's chest, feeling the warmth, the life still there. "Do you remember the drain?" Frank asked softly. Max's eyes opened a little wider. "You didn't panic," Frank continued, "even when you were stuck. You trusted me." Frank swallowed hard. "I need to trust you now." Max shifted, gathering what little strength he had left, and pressed his nose gently into Frank's palm. It was enough. The next morning, Frank made the call. The vet agreed to come to the house. Frank spent the day doing all the small things that suddenly felt enormous. He cooked chicken, even though Max barely ate. He brushed Max's fur slowly, carefully, lingering on familiar places. He carried him to the yard so he could feel the sun one more time. Neighbors passed quietly, understanding without words. As the afternoon light softened, the vet arrived, calm, respectful, unhurried. She knelt beside Max, examined him gently, then looked up at Frank. "He's ready," she said softly, "and he's not afraid." Frank nodded, tears already flowing freely. They moved Max to the porch, where the breeze was gentle and the oak tree cast long shadows across the grass. Frank sat with Max's head in his lap, fingers threaded to the fur around his ears. "You were brave," Frank whispered. "Every day." Max looked up at him one last time. His eyes were tired, but peaceful. Frank pressed his forehead to Max's. "Thank you," he said, "for choosing me." The injection was gentle, quiet, respectful. Max's breathing slowed. Then, softly, it stopped. Frank didn't move. He stayed there, holding him, rocking slightly, tears soaking into the fur he knew better than his own hands. "I'm here," he whispered, even though Max no longer needed to hear it. The vet gave Frank time. All the time he needed. That evening, Frank buried Max beneath the oak tree, the same place they had rested so many afternoons together. He placed the old harness beside him, not as a reminder of weakness, but of trust. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Frank stood there a long time. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. The house felt different that night. Empty but not hollow. In the days that followed, Frank learned how to live with the quiet. He still woke early, still brewed coffee, still sat on the porch at sunset. Sometimes he imagined he felt Max beside him, a familiar weight, a steady presence. Maybe he did, because love doesn't leave when a body does. It stays in habits, in choices, in courage. Weeks later, Frank noticed something strange. When neighbors passed his fence, they slowed. They waved. Some stopped to talk. Some brought dogs of their own, older ones, rescues, animals that needed patience more than strength. Frank listened. He told Max a story about the drain, about the choice, about staying. And every time he finished, he felt it again, that quiet certainty. He had done the hardest thing a person can do. He had chosen love over fear. On a cool autumn morning, Frank placed a small wooden sign near the oak tree. Simple words, carved carefully. He was loved. He was brave. He mattered. Frank touched the wood once, then turned back toward the house. He walked slower now, but he walked lighter, because the old German shepherd hadn't just been saved that day in the storm drain. He had saved Frank too, teaching him that the truest form of loyalty isn't holding on forever. It's knowing when to let go with love. Some bonds don't end. They change us and stay. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who believes loyalty still matters. Here at Old Dog Chronicles, every story matters, because love always leaves a mark.